to see you all here. New Hampshire. Excellent. Thank you all for being here. Okay. Well, we might still be getting a few more people in, but I think maybe we could start the recording and officially get going. So let me know when the recording is started.
It started.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Cynthia Peters. I'm co-presenting here today with Carmine Stewart. This is the third in our three-part webinar series. This one is called Strategies for Addressing Racial Inequity in Our Programs and the Field. And I want to start by thanking my co-presenter, Carmine Stewart, the fabulous Carmine Stewart, who I've just learned so much from by preparing for today and by seeing her in action in various other ways in the community and in adult education. Thank you for joining us, Carmine. Also, thanks to Megan and Ebony, who are providing tech support, which is no small task. You know, there's so many details that go into making something like this a success. So much appreciation to them for their work. And also, I just want to take this moment to thank World Education, which has made this possible, really. And, you know, not just created the space for the creation of this three-part webinar series, but just has been in the field of adult education for a long time, addressing equity issues in all sorts of different ways, and being able to draw off the work of World Education to create these three webinars has been really important. So thank you to World Ed. And before we get to the text slide, Carmen, do you want to just say hi?
Oh, just hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Great. And I'm going to turn it over to Megan now to tell us a little bit of tech details.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. You can find all the necessary controls at the bottom of your computer screen. And we're asking that today you make sure that your chat is set to all panelists and attendees. That way, if you have a question or any other concern, you're asking that question where everybody can see it. If you send it to all panelists, only the hosts of this meeting can see your question. If you have any technical questions or any comments or concerns, feel free to put them in the chat. Also, if you have any, if you need further assistance, you can contact me or Ebony at our emails listed right there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan. Okay, to get us started in today's conversation, we came up with a warm-up activity that goes like this. We want you to share in the chat a conversation that you've had about racial equity in your role as an educator. So it could look something like this. I talked with blank about blank, and you fill in the blanks. Or if you want to phrase it a different way, of course, that's totally fine. But what we're interested in conjuring up here is what conversations you all are having about racial equity. It could be in response to the last two webinars. It could be in response to other work you're doing. It could be in response to anything that's happening in the community, to the verdicts that came down last week, you know, anything at all. But what is a conversation that you've been having about this topic in your role as an educator? So take a minute, find the chat. Remember to pick in the drop-down menu all panelists and attendees. I see some people are posting to all panelists, so be careful about that. Double check that your comment went to everybody, and then just cut and paste it back so it goes to everybody. So I'm going to take a minute to look through these. Wow, this is amazing. This is amazing. This is everything from a conversation to convening a meeting, talking with your team, talking with colleagues about white privilege. We have somebody saying she hasn't had a chance to have a conversation yet. I understand feeling sad about that. Don't feel embarrassed. There's time. There's time. We can all get there. This is really great. People are talking about the hiring bias. Another person also mentioned hiring and equity in hiring. Great. There's a lot of conversations happening. Okay, great. So many conversations happening. Great. You're going to hear us emphasizing this idea of having conversations. It's really a good, important starting place. Partly when you're in conversation, that means you're not alone. You're talking to somebody else about something that matters. And that means both of your minds are coming together. And that's a better starting place than just being on your own. So this piece about having conversations is really important. Somebody's mentioning talking to her son, who was a young man of color, about his feelings about the police and what happened. Great. Thank you for that, Sarah. And Carmen says, these are all amazing. I agree. I agree. It's really inspiring me just to see all these conversations that are happening. Resources being shared, support being given. Awesome. Thank you so much. Also, people are still joining and saying hi. If you're joining, welcome. We're really happy to have you here. And please feel free to use this prompt as a warm-up. What's a conversation you've had about racial equity in your role as an educator? I see that Ebony is again going to remind people, and I will too. I'll stop harping on it in a minute, but make sure you pick from the drop-down menu all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, only the panelists will see your comment. Okay, thank you so much for all that. And it's just really warming and heartening to think that this room full of people that we have here today, you're bringing so many conversations, so much thinking, so much awareness into the room. So thank you for that. Let me share our agenda. We're going to start with just the introductory stuff, which we're in the middle of now. I'm going to provide a little bit of context for this webinar because this is the final one in the series of 3. So I'm going to just back up and share a little bit of the context. Then Carmen and I are going to address 4 areas of adult ed that we kind of divided up between us. I'm going to look at welcome and orientation. She's going to look at social and cultural norms and the collection and study of data. And then I'm going to look at advocacy. And then we're going to close out by sharing a poll with you all, which is a pretty substantive poll. It's not one of those just yes or no kinds of polls. It's got a bit of meat to it, but we hope you'll take the time to fill out that poll. It's going to tell us a lot about what you all are doing out there and what you plan on doing. And then for the end, we want to share some resources. We want you to fill out an evaluation. And in the evaluation, by the way, there's an opportunity to indicate if you need a certificate. And if you do need a certificate, you just provide your email address and we can get that to you to show that you attended. Okay, so about that context, I want to just go back and remind you all, some of you have been here for all 3 webinars. Some of you may just be joining us. So for everybody, I just want to remind us that at the first webinar, one of the things I talked about was, defining bias. What is it? How does it show up? Why does it matter? And then these 3 levels of ways to begin addressing bias. And the way I categorize them were as follows. The first one is that we can raise our own awareness so that we can change our attitudes. So that is things like taking an implicit bias test, changing what you're reading so that you can learn more about how privilege might be operational in you or in your work environment. Talking with other people, reading articles and books from points of view that aren't your own to expand your awareness, things like that, raising your own consciousness. And then the second dimension for doing this work is what I call slowing down, putting up guardrails. Okay, so these are things like what can you institutionalize in your practice that will help you slow down? Because the default is often going to be a biased default, because white supremacy is permeated in our culture and in our practice. And so to start to change that, we have to really slow down and put up proverbial guardrails against just defaulting to the biased approach. And so some ideas for how to do that included, for example, having in your lesson plan a question to yourself about how much this lesson addresses bias or contradicts bias. What are you using for your materials? What are the images that show up? You know, just asking yourself. It doesn't mean every single lesson is going to successfully do that, but if that question is there, it's going to remind you. Having opportunities to get feedback from trusted allies, giving your students a chance to give you feedback. All those kinds of things are going to slow you down and make you think twice. And then the third one is changing the water we swim in. So this is really important, often considered the most daunting, because this is where we have to put our attention to large systemic and structural ways that racism continues and influences our work. And we have to put our attention there because we can never really address bias one by just changing our own internal thoughts and feelings. We have to change how institutions work because that's the source of where the bias is going to come from. So what I take heart in is to try to remember that in the US, honestly, it took hundreds of years to create the racist structures that we have now. And they're made by humans. Okay, they're not the weather, they're not nature. They're not written in stone, they're created by humans and they can be unmade by humans. And in fact, it's even positive that it took hundreds of years to create the level of racism that we have in this country. So that means that it's going to be a slow process to undo it all, but it's possible to undo it all. And so I like to just remind myself of that because sometimes that does feel like the hardest thing to take on, but it's so important. So keeping these three dimensions in mind, we then have broken down adult education, our field and our work into 6 categories. And we just broke it down into these categories because it helps to kind of take a piece of it and then try to address it. And the top 2 you see are a little bit grayed out. And that's because Reva Pearson and I in the webinar number 2, which we did last Tuesday, took on the question of classroom practices, teacher supports, and curriculum materials. So we did those 2 in the second webinar. That leaves us with 4 to do today. So we're going to be going a little bit quickly and we're going to be just kind of picking a few strategies from each of these 4 remaining areas. And because we can't do everything, and we have created a document, an interactive document, which you can go to and get more strategies for all 6 of these areas, and you can make suggestions there. So the document is set up that anybody who has the link can suggest, okay? And so I would love it if people pile into this document and add your ideas, because Carmen and I don't know everything, Reva and I don't, nobody knows everything, nobody has all the answers, but all together we can make a really rich set of strategies that everybody can find something that they can do and move the work forward that way. So I encourage you to check out that interactive document and keep adding to the strategies in our 6 areas. So I'm going to check the chat to see if there's any questions, or Carmen, feel free to interrupt me if somebody's asking for the link to the interactive document. We can definitely get you that. And I'm just going to, yeah, the way we've set this up is I'm going to stop and check the chat, but also Carmen knows if she sees something, she might interrupt me, or Megan and Ebony might interrupt me. So feel free, we're really wanting you to use the chat as much as possible.
There was one comment that I thought was worth noting, and it spoke to the the fact that different generations, particularly the older generations, have a little bit more difficulty, may have some more challenges having conversations about this topic and racial equity in general. So I think that that was an important point, because I feel like the younger generation seems to not have such a difficult time with those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. And our classes are very age diverse. And so one of the things Riva and I pointed people to in the second webinar was just using student voice as much as possible. So it's not necessarily you as a teacher standing up there saying, you know, these are the things you should be thinking, you know, but you're bringing in materials that center other people's voices. And then that's what the students are responding to. So anyway, that's one strategy to use, but yeah, point well taken. So I'm going to get us started by diving into welcome and orientation. There is so much to say about this, honestly. I mean, I had such a hard time trying to narrow it down to two strategies that I want to focus on. And I picked these two partly because this last year has been such a dramatic year for so many reasons. So the first one is taking into account this idea that you can make your welcome and orientation have a more trauma-informed approach. That's partly because the pandemic has just escalated the way that racial inequity is experienced in this country, and it's deepened it and just put people into a position where they're just have more layers of oppression on them because of the pandemic. Also, this last year of police violence has been, you know, just something that has added a layer of trauma and stress to our students. Also, I'm going to look at using the welcome and orientation to put some serious attention on addressing inequity in digital literacy and access. So those are the two things that I'm going to talk about related to welcome and orientation, knowing that there's many more things to say. So why a trauma-informed approach? I mean, basically, we just have to have an awareness, and I'm sure most adult ed programs already do, that our students are coming to us with a lot of trauma on top of them, you know, just from getting through day-to-day life. I put this picture here. It's from the Change Agent's mental health issue, and it's by an African-American woman who talks about how the stress of the pandemic has rippled through her community in such a profound way. Just things like her mom and dad, both of them are essential workers. They're older. They haven't had a single, you know, day off due to the pandemic. They haven't gotten any kind of break. If anything, their work stress has escalated. The amount of danger that they're in has escalated because they're so exposed to the pandemic at their jobs. Her community is disproportionately suffering from COVID. And so a lot of it comes on her, you know, she's trying to support her family, her friends, her neighbors. And, you know, she just really captures the way the stress has rippled through her community. There's two other Change Agent articles in the mental health issue that talk about this experience. These are both by African-American women. One is Ebony from World Education, who you met in that welcome slide. You know, she talks about how the pandemic, the, you know, epidemic police violence, the white supremacist assault on the Capitol building, you know, just all these pieces. And then this idea that you're supposed to keep showing up at work and act normal and act like nothing's happening. You know, that all the layers of this just make for a sort of a mental health crisis, which is kind of invisible, at least in a lot of situations. It's invisible, or possibly to white people, it's more invisible than it is in communities of color. And so just centering this as a reality is so important. And then the second one by Annette Bowen from Georgia, she has her COVID diary where she kind of goes month by month to sort of talk about this escalating feeling of just out and out emergency. So I think that, and there's many more articles in this issue that help show what it feels like. Let's not, actually, what I think I want to just go to Dalsant Lavoie, who Riva and I shared this video in the second webinar. And I think it's worth going back, and I'm not going to play the whole thing again, but I just picked out some of these quotes. He says, you could be a victim of racism or of police violence. You have to know that one day it could be your turn. He says, racism is something they built against us. And sometimes you say, I don't want to go out and deal with white people. You're afraid of white people. You're afraid of white cops. And I mean, this is just such an eloquent capturing of what many white people might not be aware of, that this is what people are feeling when they go out into the world. People of color are feeling. They're feeling this feeling of like, I could be a victim right now, or one of my loved ones could be a victim. And that I have to operate in these institutions like educational institutions, work, culture, society, where the feeling is this is built against me. And being afraid of white people, that's real. What if when people come to our programs and their welcome and orientation is dominated by white people, if it is done, it's not in all programs, but in some it might be, that would be something to consider, right? That if you're presenting as a mostly white organization and people of color are coming into that, having some awareness that how that might be affecting them is going to be really important to the success of your welcome and orientation. Delsant goes on to say, what we learned in class helps us deal with this situation, thanks God. And, you know, Riva is a brilliant teacher. She's a white woman. She has been able to share supports that her students have found really helpful navigating racism in this country. What if, in addition, our welcome and orientation paid attention to that? And not just the welcome and orientation, but it could be throughout our program, throughout the students' time in the program, where these kinds of feelings are being attended to. I think that could make a real difference in students' ability to stay. Looks like I just started the video. Didn't mean to do that. I wanted to include this picture of a class at Project Hope here in Boston, taught by the amazing Shar Caver, who was teaching a class on health. But what she did was she included a lot of content about health disparities. And this is 5 women from the class who wrote for the Change Agent. And I just include this picture partly because, you know, it shows how they're all connected. I like how the woman at the bottom left is actually just reaching up to hold the hand of the woman behind her, and they're all touching each other, you know, not accidentally, but on purpose. And it just tells me something about, you know, when you create opportunities in your program for people to be connected, you know, whether you're head on taking on health disparities or head on taking on racism, even if you're not necessarily doing that, or even if you're inching towards some of those topics, if you're giving people a chance to not be isolated, to break down barriers between each other, you're addressing some of that trauma by just creating an alternative space. So I want to suggest that the more your welcome and orientation can look like that, and then the way you can infuse that throughout the rest of the program, you know, the more you're going to be responding to some of the trauma that people of color are coming into our programs with. What can you do right now? One suggestion is that you read this new document that was just published called A Trauma-Informed Approach to Workforce. This is by Vicky Coitz and Stacy Wagner. And the link, when you get the copy of these slides, you'll be able to click on that and go to that document. But just reading the document, sharing it with each other, forming a little study group to think together about how can we bring some of these ideas into our welcome and orientation practice. That would be a great starting place. Of course, at your welcome and orientation, you can share resources for care. You can, let me just dive down to the last bullet. You can have a buddy system, perhaps. You can have students from your program be part of your welcome and orientation, and then you could match them up with new students. And even better if these could be paid mentors. Okay, That's a bit about the first strategy. I want to say something about the second strategy. I feel that I'm a little bit over my time. So, but I would like you.
Keep going.
Okay, I'll
Great.
take a couple more minutes, and I want to ask you to just jump back into the chat now and let us know, what are some of the experiences that your students have had where there have been barriers to remote learning. So what's your experience been of students' barriers to remote learning? Because that's the next piece that I want to address, and I have some very concrete resources to share with you. Hardware, iffy internet, reliable Wi-Fi, Zoom fatigue, distractions at home, slow internet, troubleshooting, lack of technology, no internet, no smartphone, no computers, low digital literacy skills, right? Shared hardware, they're sharing with their kid, with their spouse, with their cousin. Homelessness, thank you. Access to tools. Everyone at home is on different technology. Yes, okay, great. Missing the social interaction, no quiet space, thank you. Well, yeah, you all hit a lot of the really important points. Indeed, you know, the data shows that people of color are less likely to have internet access. They're less likely to have access to devices or to broadband. And I have some very concrete suggestions here that you can bring into your welcome and orientation. One is this new development, which is a program of digital navigators. And this is something that the EdTech Center here at World Education has been leading in coalition with Digital US. And I put the link here for how to find out more about the digital navigator. But what a digital navigator is someone from your staff. It could be a staff member, a teacher, or it could be a student. And I want you to remember that you probably have a lot of resources in your students to play this role. Not everybody, but you have some. And so students could become digital navigators. And what a digital navigator does is they help learner workers secure connectivity to reliable internet, access low-cost devices, give tech support, provide referrals to digital literacy and upskilling programs, and provide foundational digital skills. Okay, so that's what a digital navigator learns how to do. There's a navigator, sort of a hub of resources for digital navigators, and there's a toolkit. So these are two really good starting places. The pandemic has shone a light on the inequity, the racial inequity in digital access. So many things have moved online. And so that's one way the pandemic has made racism worse because the already existing inequities are now compounded. So by addressing this digital piece and, you know, taking on this project of digital navigation, I think is a great starting place, and the resources are there. People have started doing the thinking. I also want to share a couple of resources that I found out about, including a source for low-cost internet, an organization called PCs for People. Also, you know, libraries are loaning out hotspots. So you could find out if your local library is loaning out hotspots, and you could help your students get a library card and then get a hotspot. I included one example from the Providence Public Library there. And then finally, there's this wonderful work that Rachel Riggs has been doing. She's out of Maryland. She created a digital literacy action plan. This is another concrete tool that you can use at your welcome when you're meeting students for the first time, or maybe it's the second or third time when you spring this action plan on them. It's a Google form that you can make a copy of and adapt if you want to, and use it to help walk through with your students what their digital literacy action plan should be. And then finally, I heard some of you mention this whole issue of, you know, the physical space that our students have to do the work in. And I found a really good article about the inequities of our learning environments here. And one thing it mentioned in the article is that they set up, this is a college, but we can do this in our programs. They set up an online learning and teaching committee to investigate methods that work for everyone and identify and address inequities. So these are teaching methods that take into account my student might be in a crowded room when I'm asking them to do this task, or they might have a crying baby. How do I skillfully respond in this classroom situation? So there's some concrete ideas that I hope are useful. I'm going to stop sharing and let Carmen take over with this next round. And I'm going to just check the chat while she's getting going to see. Yeah, Laura's saying yes, thumbs up to the digital navigator. Wow, you trying saying that 3 times fast. Emergency, Susan has an idea about the emergency broadband benefit. Great. If anybody has links, I see that Gwen has put in a link, get emergency broadband. Great, thank you all. Yes, this is a really important place for people to share ideas. So, and when you get the link to the recording of this webinar, you'll be able to read the chat more carefully because it will all be there. So, all right.
All right.
Carmen, take it away.
Okay, thank you. So again, Cynthia identified the 6 areas that where we can address inequity with the focus on the 4 that we're talking about today. So she just did a wonderful job with the welcome and orientation. And so we're going to shift to strategies to address inequity in the area of cultural and social norms. And this section and the next section, collection and study of data, both deal with the idea of changing the water we swim in, which was one of the 3 strategies that Cynthia shared for combating bias. So the phrase, the water that we swim in, I think it's becoming more common, but it actually originated from a commencement speech that was delivered at Kenyon College in 2005. And so I actually want to read for you just a portion of the speech by David Foster Wallace. And so what he said was, there are these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the heck is water?" And the point of it is that, of the fish story, is that it's merely that the most obvious, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. So our cultural and social norms are the water that we swim in. And because they are the water we swim in, sometimes they are difficult to see and difficult to discuss and talk about. So cultural and social norms are basically the unwritten rules of a society, and we all have them. And they're the rules that govern our behavior, that help us figure out what's appropriate behavior, what's not acceptable. And again, they're very invisible to us, as the water is invisible to the fish. So I should actually say that they're invisible until someone violates them, because that's when we become aware that those norms exist, right? So when we follow our social cultural norms, we're rewarded by acceptance, we're rewarded by belonging. But when we don't follow our social and cultural norms, we risk disapproval or being seen as an outcast or being seen as weird. And so they kind of govern our behavior, even though they're unwritten rules. So if you think about the cultural norms that we have in this country, for example, of invading someone's personal space, you don't ever see written rules about how much space you should leave between you and another human. But as soon as someone stands just a little bit too close, you become aware of that social and cultural norm, and even more aware of the fact that someone has now violated it. So another good example that I'm using in this slide is the image of a treadmill. If you're one of those folks who goes to the gym a lot, you see an empty row of treadmills, you jump on. There's no rule that says the person can't get on the treadmill next to you. However, if someone jumps on the treadmill next to you, rather than 1, 2, or 3 treadmills down, you feel some kind of way. It's the same with movie theater seating. So we all kind of have these unwritten rules of society that we never state explicitly, but we all we know that they're there, and we know that when they've been violated. So our cultural norms actually happen on multiple different levels. So we have national norms, things that Americans do that other countries may not do. We have regional norms. We have organizational, programmatic, and even familial norms. And the dominant culture is typically who establishes those norms. And the dominant culture can be the culture that is a numerical majority, or it can just be the subset of the culture that has the most power, or it actually can be both. So in the United States, as you might expect, cis straight white males are typically the dominant culture. They're the ones who who had the power to determine how our institutions were set up, how our laws were made, how policies were enacted. They are the larger, numerically larger, and the group that held the power in this country at our founding. And all of those norms and cultural and social norms have followed us throughout the generations. If you look regionally, if you think about the South has norms that are not necessarily the same as Northern or Northeastern norms. You can look at cultural movies like My Cousin Vinny or the book Dispatches from Pluto, which really make a good juxtaposition of Northern versus Southern norms. In locales, you have cultural norms, what we do in this community or that neighborhood. And we have different expectations for those neighborhoods based on that. In our families, we have social and cultural norms as well. So by nature, since these norms are established by either numerical majority or by the folks who have the most power, they're rooted in inequity. So if you think about parents versus children, where you've got, you may have 8 children and 2 parents. So numerically, they're the minority, but because they hold the power, they're the majority. And all of us have probably heard the "because I said so," which is a great example of the inequity that exists in that relationship. So America and its institutions are dominated by white supremacist culture. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the difference between white supremacy and white supremacist culture, so that or white supremacists and white supremacy culture, so that we're very clear about what that means. But the larger point here is that we have to, dismantling that requires us moving past defensiveness and excuses and really moving past guilt and shame and blame, and really just examining the patterns of inequity that exist in our country, and then choosing to either eliminate or at least attenuate those inequities as we see them. It requires all the members of the community to do the hard work, rather than leaving it to Black, Indigenous, people of color on your staff, in your student body, on your board, to do the brunt of the equity work, or to either suffer in silence. And dismantling requires that we confront the harm that inequity and racism cause head on, and be committed to addressing them and preventing future harm. So going back to the idea of what white supremacist versus white supremacy culture, the difference between white supremacist and white supremacy culture is that a white supremacist is a person who is committed to the idea that white people constitute a superior race and should therefore dominate society. And it's typically to the exclusion of others or to the detriment of others. And I think for the most part, most of us agree that these folks are not concerned with diversity, equity, and inclusion. In fact, they're against those ideals. So when we talk about our culture, we're not saying that our culture is a culture full of white supremacists, but we're saying that institutions that define our culture by white ideals and experiences, thoughts, and beliefs are what predominate in our society. So it's about the entitlements that are sometimes provided. And I think sometimes people also have this conversation where they have difficulty understanding that idea, because the idea of privilege makes it sound like you should have a life of ease. And having privilege doesn't mean that that you don't have difficulties and hardships. Having privilege means that you don't have certain significant barriers that other people have just by virtue of having been born who they are. Right. So our programs have cultural and social norms as well. And being that our programs are created by the same institutions that create the rest of our society, they tend to have, we tend to see some roots of white supremacy culture in adult education. So I'm actually going to ask a question in the chat, and I'd like you to respond if you can. But when you think about your program, who has the dominant voice in your program? What are the dominant voices in your program? Who holds the power in your program? Who determines policies? Okay, so Nan says white women, deans and teachers, senior leadership team, white women, white men. Funders, absolutely funders. And who are our funders? Typically, yes, absolutely. The State Adult Education Agency, right? So most of the folks who establish the culture of our programs have never been students in our programs. They may not connect to our students diversity. They may not connect to our students' experiences of poverty. They may not connect to our students' experiences of trauma. So of course, they're not designing programs with those kinds of things in mind. They're typically the staff voices or the director voices or the adult education agency voices. And so the social and cultural norms in our program actually can advance white supremacy. So for an example, one of the things that Cynthia and I talked about as we were preparing this session is that often we're able to achieve greater outcomes for students who are English language learners than we are by students who are failed by the K-12 system. So why is it that we educate some students, we have more success with educating some students over others? When we talk about the fact that our outreach efforts may not necessarily appeal to students who are seeking adult education, do we make our programs look and feel like the education systems that they were a part of, that they had horrible experiences with before they came to us? Do we have a deficit model of education? Do we look at our students as problems to solve? Do we look at them as what they lack instead of what it is that they offer and what opportunities they create and provide, and what gifts they have, what strengths they have? When we look at our teaching force, is there representation in our teaching force? Are we recruiting from diverse spaces to make sure that we're bringing in teachers and tutors and counselors and staff who look like our student body? Do we take advantage of our alum or our current students so that students feel that they're getting welcomed by folks who know their experiences? There's a subjectivity of fit in our hiring decisions. We often feel like, well, you know, that person wasn't a good fit. And sometimes that can kind of be a smokescreen for other beliefs that we've hidden or unconscious biases that we're not necessarily aware of. Creating the conditions for staff to feel other than out of place, staff of diverse backgrounds. And then also one of the things that I see a lot is sometimes people have the need, and I don't think this is specific to adult education, but people who are in positions of authority have a need to put people in their place and make sure they understand what's appropriate for them and what isn't appropriate for them. Do we have a formal procedure in place for addressing inequality, or are there repercussions for folks who speak out against any bias or power imbalances that they see? Is there representation in your curriculum, in your discourses, on your board, your staff, your volunteers? So all of these places where we examine our programs are places where we can see how our cultural norms exist and could be disrupted in a way that allows our programs to feel more welcoming and inviting to our students and to folks who are interested in our program. Do we treat our adult students like children? I shared in a past workshop a list of classroom rules. I was looking for classroom. I don't even remember what I was searching for, but I came across this program that has a list of their classroom rules on their website, and that list of classroom rules will probably be one of the first things that someone experiences when they learn about that program. And it was written in such offensive language that in most workshops, I actually allow people to open their annotation tools and just write on everything that they find objective or offensive in that. And it's always so interesting how many things people identify. So in our policies, are we more likely to believe, does our organizational culture, are we more likely to believe students who are white over students who are students of color, or immigrant students over students who are color? If they're late, are we more likely to believe why they're here? Even about our ideals about how they entered our programs, our cultural and social norms determining how we treat people based on these beliefs of why they're here. I actually am very interested in doing a study on what people's beliefs are about GED learners and why they think they're here, because the stories are sometimes incredible, the beliefs are incredible. So then also, do we have written policies for our for discipline? Are they being applied equitably? So if we want to have programs that are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to start shifting the cultural norms in our programs that privilege staff voices, that privilege white voices, that privilege heteronormative voices, that privilege non-disabled voices. We have to really kind of take a step back and evaluate what norms exist. How do we become more aware? How do we make the invisible visible? And then how do we do something about it? How do we include those voices so that we can change them to policies that are more inclusive? Adult education and social justice work. I don't know. I know that we don't say that to people when they come into the field, but it absolutely is. So as we consider the potential of education as a practice of freedom that strives for social change and a more equitable society, we have to look at our roles, our own roles in our community and in our programs, and shift the culture to one that's supportive of that diversity. Okay, so I want to talk about this idea of cultural and social norms, that we can actually modify our social and cultural norms. And so what I want to do is I want you to think about a continuum, because, as Cynthia was asking you to talk about the conversations that you've had, as she was asking you to talk about like who have you spoken with about these equity, there was such a huge range. I was so excited to see all of those things that you were putting in the chat. But there were people who were like, well, we're not really there yet, or I really haven't had those conversations. And that's okay, because we're all on a continuum of not implementing DEI practices and really engaging in this work to really fully being soldiers in that work. And so what I'd like you to do right now is to think about your program. And if you were to evaluate your program on this continuum, where one is we're not prioritizing DEI at all, your program, not you personally, but your program as a whole, and try to think of this through the eyes of your students. If you feel like, do you feel like your program is 1, not implementing DEI, not really prioritizing it at all, or 5, we are implementing this in every single area of our program with every single stakeholder. Everyone knows who we are, where we are. DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thanks for that question, Deborah. So where do you think you are? Where would you put your program on there? So I'm starting to see an answer come in. So again, 1 is we're not engaging in this work yet. And 5 is, oh, I see a 0. Okay. So thank you all for those responses. I really appreciate that. And I think it's important to focus on the fact that there's so many different areas of our organizations to examine, and we're all works in progress, and we can begin to move work forward, and we're not in this work on our own. I think it's important to say that. Cynthia, did you want to say something?
Yeah, somebody had made a comment earlier on that there's a culture of silence, among particularly white administrators or who are in the leadership of an adult ed program, and just, having to try to break through that is part of the challenge.
And so one of the things, you guys are kind of getting a little bit ahead of me. So privileging student voice is one way, one strategy that we can definitely use to try to shift the cultural and social norms in our programs. We actually have a student body that we started here, or it's like a programming body called the Adult Literacy Learners and Educators Network. And we have students on the steering committee. And we were planning to do our first program about vaccination. And one of our students said, you know what? No, we are not doing that. And we actually ended up taking her idea and focusing on something that was more uplifting. And it just felt so great to have a student say, you're missing the mark. This isn't what we care about. We don't want to have that conversation, not in this space. And it really was nice to really be put in our place. So privileging student voice is one way that you can begin to shift those norms. And it starts little by little. And sometimes you may not always be able to do exactly what they're asking, but you'll at least know where their thinking is and where they'd like your program to go. And it's very easy to shift those cultural norms. Honestly, in the last year, we went from hugs and handshakes to fist bumps and elbow bumps, right? It's possible. We can do it when we commit to it. We can modify the norms of our organizations by showing a greater commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can use surveys and focus groups as a way to bring student voice into our program. We can have a student council or student leadership team. Some of your organizations probably already have that, and maybe just aren't asking questions about, how could we make our program more comfortable for you? How can we include you more in the decision making? What would you like this program to look like, or what's missing? There are ways to get that feedback, or by having a student rep on the board of directors. And I heard someone earlier in the chat when Cynthia asked that question said, yes, I talked to my director about getting a student on the board of directors. Absolutely, because our boards sometimes are pretty oblivious to the things that our students are really experiencing. And and we just don't have deep knowledge of folks that we just don't have interactions with. Efforts to make diversity and equity, inclusion, cultural norms, they have to start with the leadership. And a lot of people have said that. And it doesn't mean that if your leadership's not on board, you shouldn't do that work. But part of your work has to be getting the leadership to understand that it is something that's important to you. And I can say, it's something that I've brought up certainly here at Seeds of Literacy in Cleveland. And I think our board members heard me say it enough that they actually wrote it into our strategic plan in terms of what staff, diversifying our board, diversifying our tutor force. And we actually have board committees that are now focused on finding different sources to advertise for tutors and to advertise for staff so that we can increase that diversity. And also, if you just really try to examine the student experience, starting with from your website to how students complete your program, it'll give you an idea of those spaces. So I want to talk about something that I've been doing that's been very exciting from December until next month. I've worked with 9 organizations, 5ACES, which is an organization which is a part of World Education, convened some educators who wanted to take on some diversity, equity, and inclusion work as organizations. And so these 9 programs agreed to do this diversity audit process where they use this audit tool to really look at their programs and to really ask questions about what it looks like to implement diversity, equity, and inclusion in their programs. So what the programs did, I'll show you the tool in just a moment, but what the programs did, Cynthia, am I good on time?
A little bit behind, maybe,
Okay.
Yeah, you need, and you still want to do the data part, so.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
right. So basically what these organizations did is they looked at this tool, and I'll actually just go to it. And the tool looks at their program in terms of whether they're not implementing diversity, equity, inclusion, planning implementation, beginning implementation, expanding that implementation, or if they've institutionalized it and made it just a part of how they do business. And so they looked at the different parts, every part of their program, from their marketing materials to reception, to orientation and intake, to instruction, to assessment, all of those things. And they asked questions like, so does our program demonstrate a commitment to race, diversity, equity, and inclusion in all marketing materials? There are materials create a welcoming climate for students. Is it in students' first language? And so they looked at this tool and they evaluated their organizations, and they chose one particular area that they wanted to investigate. And then they distributed that survey to different stakeholders throughout their organization. And based on the feedback of those surveys, they identified objectives that they wanted to address. They created a plan, and now they're all in the process of implementing that plan. And what was really exciting about that is that they were able to collect data from their programs that they didn't have, that gave them a better idea of how they were implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. And so that actually goes right into the collection and study of data. And what we're going to talk about is how to collect and analyze program data to examine the extent to which you're implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in your program, and then how to disaggregate your data to determine any problematic patterns that might exist. So it's very easy to make assumptions about programs and where we are with relation to being equitable and inclusive. But by returning to the idea of the water that we swim in, it's easy to be oblivious to how steeped we are in our own experiences and how oblivious we might be to the experiences of our students. And so our perceptions of where we are may not necessarily match to the reality of our students and staff members of diverse backgrounds. So we know how we want our programs to feel to students and to our staff members of color. We know what our desires are, but our desires can actually cloud our perceptions of how effectively we do that. So collecting data allows you to identify patterns that you can't see anecdotally. And often in those conversations, sometimes in conversations of diversity, we use anecdotes to kind of resist an idea. So for example, a recent conversation I saw on social media, a man was saying, well, not all cops are bad. My brother's a cop and his wife is Black, so he can't be racist. Well, that anecdote doesn't negate the clear pattern of police brutality against Black and brown men. So the data allows you to get away from the anecdote and look at actual patterns of things that are going on in your program. It gives space for students and staff members of color to voice how they really feel, where they may not necessarily feel comfortable sharing it in conversation or giving feedback, particularly your students who come from cultures where it isn't acceptable to question authority. So looking at your data allows you to be a little bit more objective, and it also helps you to kind of move beyond your perception. So some of the findings from the group in Massachusetts were that their perceptions of their program didn't necessarily match what was connected. And so this is not any particular program. These are just some examples. And so looking at the area of orientation and intake, some of the folks in this program rated their program as institutionalized. We use this practice through every level of our program, every stakeholder, we're all aware of it. the same number of people said, I don't think we're implementing that practice at all. And so what it did is it gave programs a chance to step back and look at like, well, are we just not communicating that we do this well, or are we not implementing this as well as we think that we are? And so what it does is it opens up the door to conversations. The disparities could be a function of that their practice is scaled but not communicated well. But it could also be an indication that there are some blind spots in the program that they need to address or look at. So this is my last slide, Cynthia. So get ready. So I think that another, so I use this slide, even though it's about incarceration rates. If we just said that there were, over 10,000 people incarcerated in the country, that would give us one picture. But when we look at the incarceration rates by race and by age and by gender, it gives us a completely different picture. And I use this slide as an example to show that disaggregating data is looking at your outcomes of students separated by demographic groups. So you can see how your program practices may be implementing certain students differently than others. Your data can show the progress of your program, but disaggregating data shows progress in terms of equitable outcomes. So you want to see how your program is serving every student. So if 75% of your students, for example, if 75% of your students show academic progress, but then you disaggregate the data and see that 95% of that 75% are of one race, you might want to ask, how might you be more effective at educating students of other races? Maybe there's something that's happening that's keeping those students from other students from succeeding. In Ohio, K-12 programs are required to disaggregate data to show that their efforts, that they're making efforts to achieve equitable outcomes for all students. And I think that that's a practice that adult education could really benefit from, because you start to see that, oh, well, our ESOL students are doing great. However, our level 2 and 3 students in our ABE program are not. So looking at your data in this way, attendance, retention, discipline data, progress, graduation, all of it allows you to see the ways that your program might need to do a better job of serving students of different backgrounds. And the last point that I'm going to make is that our adult ed funding metrics do not make this work easy. They do not encourage DEI necessarily. So the strong emphasis on workforce development, at Seeds of Literacy, only 77% of our students come in reading. 77% of our students come in reading below a ninth grade reading level. So most workforce programs require at least that. So this huge focus on workforce makes it look like we're not making progress for our students, because that isn't what they're here for at this moment. They're here to get the skills so that they can, the competencies that will allow them to move to that space. Often programs also, because of how we're funded, exclude the lowest level learners who can't show progress on standardized assessments. So we have to think about how to advocate for better program metrics. And with that, I'll stop sharing so that Cynthia can take over with more on advocacy.
Wow, thank you, Carmen. That was amazing, rich, lots of information coming out, lots of stuff happening in the chat. If anybody has any questions for Carmen about anything she just presented, please feel free to put that in the chat. We have time to slow down here and take your questions. I don't want anybody to feel too rushed. But yeah, good point. I mean, just all the things you raise about data make us realize that our advocacy could address some of those things. In our advocacy, we could figure out how to advocate for funding that addresses more needs. We could advocate for funding that doesn't pigeonhole our learners or pigeonhole our programs to have to report certain outcomes, which then kind of cement us into certain institutionalized practices that, may or may not be more or less white supremacist. So, being able to identify those things so that we can then contest them, that's huge. All right. Is there anything that we should, okay, great. People are liking the disaggregating of the data. Good. All right. Okay. Let me say a little bit about advocacy. This has been a lot, everybody. Thank you so much for your attention. What I want to say about advocacy is just, there's so much to say, and I had to pick a few things to focus on. And I came up with these 4 points. Mainly, I just want us to have a more expansive definition of it. I think that perhaps first and foremost is seeing student leadership and voice as critical to the growth, survival, and direction of our field. So that's a pretty big deal, like in our programs, being able to create a venue for student voice, because it may be that our entire field is at stake here. We could make our programs into civics hotspots, and I have some ideas about that. But we could center student voices by showcasing the many ways that they already show agency, not treating them like, as Carmen was talking about, the sum of their deficits and all the ways they need to get fixed so that they can be better advocates. But our students are already pretty amazing advocates for themselves and their families. Well, all we need to do is surface that and tell those stories and identify it as advocacy, because they might not realize that that is even what it is. And by offering pathways for them to develop their leadership in the program and in the community. We, of course, need to be fighting for adult ed funding at the state and federal level. Many of our programs and our state organizations already do this really well. But I would also suggest that we also need to fight for changes in our policies that would lift all boats, that strengthen the social safety net, and that address racial inequity. And finally, I want to keep inserting this piece about seeing the workplace as a place of advocacy and organizing. That is a place where people can exercise power. You can exercise power in the voting booth. You can exercise power by campaigning for laws and policy changes. You can protest on the streets and make your voice heard. And at your workplace, you can also make your voice heard in certain other ways. And that is an important place of advocacy, which I don't think we talk about enough. So I want to give you all a chance to do something now. So instead of diving into more content, I just want to share these links to these 4 sets of Google Slides and invite you to check them out. The first one is something that helps you train your students to become voting ambassadors. And it was designed for the 2020 election. And a voting ambassador is somebody who has the knowledge and skill and practice to get community members registered to vote and learning the issues and then voting. Now, 2020 is obviously over, but there's lots of elections coming up, local elections, midterm elections, whatever you got going on in your community. Could you train your students to become voting ambassadors? And would this content be a starting place for you? Obviously, you don't have to use it all, you can adapt it, but it could be. There's a shorter set of slides that investigate suppression versus fraud, because let's face it, you can all vote till the cows come home, but if there is systemic racist suppression of the vote, many voices will not be heard. So it's really important to understand that piece too. And the third one is called Moving from Anguish to Power. It's about 2 women who got huge rent increases. They were facing eviction and they chose to fight back. And it's in our mental health issue, actually. The reason being that they found sustenance for their mental health just by standing up and saying, no, you can't kick me out of the home I've lived in for 40 years, and that's just a really powerful example of advocacy and the ripple effects it can have in all parts of your life. And then finally, something on sick days. So hopefully in the chat, did Megan or Ebony put in the links? Great, they're showing up now. There's voting ambassadors. Yeah, so as these links show up, please click on them and check them out. Joan is asking, is this 2 hours or 1.5? It's 1.5 hours. We're ending at 5:30. So right now there's 2 up, and just sort of self-organize. You can dip into all 4 of them or 1 or 2 of them, whatever you want to do, whatever looks interesting to you. And you'll have these links to check out in more depth later. So what I want you to do is when you're looking at them, you could even be thinking about whether or not it addresses any of these 4 points that I raise about expanding our understanding of advocacy. So I'm going to give you all a chance to check those out. How long do we have for this? Good question. About 2 or 3 minutes. Not much time, but I'm depending on you to just grab maybe one and check it out and get the feel for it. 2 or 3 minutes. That means finishing by like about 5:09. Yes, Urena, you will get a copy of the PowerPoint links. You'll get a PDF of the slides, and the PDF will have, clickable links in it. And you'll also get a recording of this, a link to the recording. So you'll be able to revisit all of this. So Naylene's says, moving from anguish to power is advocacy. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about what you think about that. Or if you're checking out that story, yeah, tell me more what you notice happening in that story.
These are great, Cynthia.
Good. Which one are you looking at? I see lots of people, 41, 42, 44 plus, 30 plus. And Mark says, if you click on the links, you can copy to your Google platform. Yeah.
I think we should have in the US mental health days in addition to our regular sick days. There's some days you just can't do it.
Thank you. Thank you. Mental health is a real part of our overall health. And if we have learned anything from the pandemic, it must be that. Carrie says, I was just having this conversation with a student last night whose landlord said he was going to raise the rent after her living there paying on time for 17 years. Yeah, so Carrie, what would it be like for your student to read this story by these two women who at first felt completely defeated by their rent increases, but then found a way to fight back? Even if your student can't quite follow exactly in their footsteps, just knowing that it's possible is a huge change for a lot of people, knowing that they might have rights. Yeah. And then maybe making a little class project out of what rights do we have as tenants in this state or in this locality. Yeah, great. It sounds like people have been able to check out some of the slides. Thank you for doing that. Somebody looked at the piece about sick days. Yeah, and then you're linking that to your own organization where teachers are all part-time and your hourly pay hasn't been raised in years and you get no benefits, including no paid time off. Wow. Yeah, so this is not just an issue for our students, but it's an issue for those of us who are teaching in the field. And, that's something that Carmen has talked about a lot, when you're thinking about diversifying your staff, but you don't have full-time jobs, and you don't have reasonable salaries or benefits, or you only have the kind of job that works for people who are retired and are earning a pension, then you're not opening yourself up to an influx of new folks and community members. So thank you for noticing all that. Let's see. Let's go back to the presentation. Thank you all for going on that little field trip and checking out those slides. I share them just because I want you to have access to some real teaching tools that you can bring into the classroom tomorrow that would start helping you frame students as agents of change in their communities and their families, and in their workplaces. And, one of the lesson plans there was about voting and about becoming a voting ambassador. And I just want to remind people about what Delcent Lavoie said about that. He said, voting is our nuclear weapon. But he even mentioned that, even though they have gerrymandering and voter suppression, we have to go out to vote. Okay, so this is something that is on students' minds, and, supplying them with the training to be able to not just go vote themselves, but organize their community to be voters and to take on voter suppression in their community. That is where you're really getting into some deep advocacy. Okay, so I said I wanted to expand the definition of advocacy, and I have this piece from The Change Agent where a woman talks about how she had to advocate for herself in her family, just because she wanted to come to the United States, her family didn't want her to. She had to make a case for why she should be able to come. I think many of our students, maybe particularly women, might have to kind of bump up against family norms to be able to meet their goals. So sharing a story like this kind of centers that student as and makes that form of advocacy a legitimate form of advocacy, and a place where you get to develop that muscle and train yourself. For each one of these, I put the issue number and the page number, so it's easy for you to find later on if you want. And here's a story by a woman who talks about how her son was being bullied in school. And, at first she was believing what the teachers and the principal were saying about her son. They were kind of blaming her son. But she investigated in her own way and found out what was happening. They were calling him racist names, and she took it on to meet with the teacher. And then when that didn't work, she went and met with the principal. And so she kind of didn't stop until she got satisfaction. And she said it was really hard being brave enough to try to meet with the principal and to try to take this stuff on as a person speaking English as a second language. But she said it was even harder to see what her kid was going through. And so that was what pushed her to do it. And I think that's true of so many of the parents who come to our programs, that they are out there in the world advocating for their children, even though it's really hard. And they're not thinking of themselves as advocates, or warriors, even for their children. So I love when we can share stories like this that help people see themselves in that role. I'm putting this story up from Matias Rodriguez, who was a guest speaker at our second webinar. He went to the El Rio Learning Center, and he tells a story about a student in their class who used to ride her bike to school every day, but she got in a bike accident. She could no longer ride her bike. She stopped showing up at school. And the reason why was because there wasn't a bus route late enough for her to get home from school. And because they had the leadership council at this program, and because students were prepared and able to think of themselves as advocates and already thought of themselves as people who don't just accept problems laying down, but try to find a solution, the leadership council organized to meet with the city council to get the bus company to add an extra route so that this student could get home from school. And then not only that, but they organized to get bus shelters put in so that when people are waiting in the 100-degree heat in Tucson, they're not standing in the direct sun. So that's the kind of thing where by having a leadership council, even if you start small, even if it's, well, there should be better lights in the parking lot, that's a starting place. And then you get used to this idea that your voice will be heard and you can make change. And then it kind of ripples out. Matthias also talked about how, if you remember, he was living in an apartment complex and there were refugees from Africa living there too, and they did not appear to work. And he was going off to work every day as a landscaper. And he says, that what he was thinking inside was, wow, what a bunch of freeloaders, these people who aren't working. But in his class, he learned about what refugees have gone through. And he realizes that he had been numb to that reality, and that he was just falling into a narrative that that is a kind of a white dominant mainstream media narrative about refugees. and the class helped wake him up. So I'm putting that back in here because I want to say that part of what we need to do, part of what advocacy looks like, is changing the narrative. You know, it's bringing into our classrooms some shift to the dominant paradigm. And that was a great example of how that affected Matthias. He also made the point that, you know, it was great to get his GED, and he was grateful to El Rio Learning Center for helping him get his GED. But he said the thing that really affected him was being on the leadership council. That's what set him up in life to really go after the things that he wants to go after. So I saw Mark Truszkowski was mentioning, wow, how come leadership councils keeps coming up? And it does indeed keep coming up. And I think that that is a really important starting place. So I want to tell this story. This is a project that was funded by World Education way back in 1999. And what it was an effort that matched community organizations with adult ed programs to collaborate on to meet the needs of the CBO and of the students. And one example that I want to share is this campaign on contingent work asked students if they would help create a survey to find out the experience of community members when it comes to contingent work. So they asked students to interview day laborers to find out about their working conditions and their wages. And so here you have a bunch of adult ed students working with a community-based organization to design a survey, to carry out the survey, to collect the data from the survey, and then to mold that data into an analysis. And so the learning is just enormous. All the basic skills, all the speaking and listening, the crunching of numbers, the crunching of data, and also just the connection to the issue, because the students in the class are members of this community that they were surveying. So it's one example of how, you know, advocacy isn't just, you know, voting or changing laws. It's also, you know, participating on a community level with organizations that are doing this kind of work. Now, I mentioned that I think the workplace is a great place of advocacy. And I wanted to share this story, which is about the car washeros in New York City, who many of them are undocumented. They were experiencing wage theft, really poor conditions. Their goal was to at least be able to make minimum wage. And so they got together with some community organizations and with one union, the retail, wholesale, and department store union, and started a campaign of car wash workers in New York City to fight for better conditions. This story isn't to say that this is what everybody has to do, but it's just that this exists, that people are fighting for themselves and their rights at the workplace level. And so wherever you can find stories like that and you can center those stories, it opens up that conversation, it opens up that possibilities. Many undocumented immigrants aren't aware that it's against the law for their wages to be stolen. And if they are aware of it, it's too scary to think that they can do something about it. And indeed, that is something to be really careful about. But just the fact that there are some resources that are available to people is good to know. Okay, we're going to start closing up. We have about 10 minutes to go, and I want to make sure to leave time for people to do the final poll and to do the evaluation. And I'll check the chat for any comments, but I want to kind of offer this as a little bit of a wrap up. We talked about the 3 dimensions. These are things for you to keep in mind as you go forward. We want to be raising awareness. We want to be setting up guardrails and slowing ourselves down. And we want to be trying to change the water we swim in. We have 6 areas in adult ed that we can keep generating strategies for doing this work. We have the interactive document that you can go to, see what people are saying, add your own suggestions, put what you're trying and what's worked and what hasn't worked. So we have that. And then finally, I added this third box, you plus at least one. I just want to circle back to that idea of not doing this alone. Carmen and I have both focused on this a bit. At least have one person with you. If even better, a small group. Find your trusted allies. Be in conversation with others. Find your accountability buddy. This is a new term for me. I Googled it and I discovered that it entered the lexicon in 2008. So I'm late to the party, but I love this term. We need each other to be able to keep doing this work, to hold ourselves accountable, and to give ourselves inspiration and support, because it is hard work, not easy to do, and therefore reminding ourselves to bring in help and resources is the right thing to do. So we have a poll, and I would love to take some time now to do that. And so I have the text of the poll up here, but you're going to get this poll in a Zoom poll format, and it's multiple choice, and you can check all that apply. And I encourage you to check all the things that you think you might do. This is our way of encouraging people to think concretely about what your next steps might be. So are you able to share the poll, Megan? There it is. Yeah, so it's a meaty poll. This isn't just a yes or no situation. Take your time, go through, check off all the things that you think you might do coming out of this webinar. Okay, thank you. I see people are watching it fill in. This is great. And then we'll share the results. Okay. Megan, tell me when you think, when we have a sense of, oh, I see the percentage that so far we have 78% have participated so far. So maybe we'll just leave a little bit more time. You can get a couple more people. Okay. We're at about 80% have voted. So maybe that's a good breaking point and we can share the responses. Okay. Can people see the responses? I hope people can see. It looks like people are interested in doing a lot of these things. I think I'll notice the largest ones, reading, expanding my reading to expand my understanding, considering what we can do at the program level to address racial equity. That's got a lot of votes. Also getting a lot of votes was examining cultural norms in our organization that aren't conducive to equity. Learn more independently or with others about trauma-informed practices. That one got a lot of votes too. Great. Okay. So I know that some people aren't teachers, and so you can't, you're not gonna be able to do the teacher parts, and some people aren't administrators, so they're not necessarily going to be able to do certain other parts. But this is really good to see, where people want to go with this. And I hope it's useful for all of you to look at too, to see where your colleagues are leaning. All right, let's move to, I see some people mentioning that they would like to get a certificate. So let me just remind you that you can get a certificate partly by filling out the evaluation, which we're going to give you the link to now. Before we get, actually go ahead, Ebony or Megan, to drop in the link to the evaluation. While you're doing that, I want to just include this slide one more time with Carmen's and my name and email address, and just invite you, if you have questions or comments, or if you want to pursue this work in your program or region and you want to contact us, here's how you can contact us. We can also put our email addresses in the chat, and also you'll be getting these slides, so you'll be able to find it that way too. Carmen, do you have any parting words or anything you want to say to close out? You're on mute.
My chat box, I couldn't move it away from my mute button.
I know that always happens right when you don't want it to.
Okay, yeah. I think I would just say that I think that, a lot of times we feel like it feels like such, when we're trying to look at a huge problem, it feels like we're so small. And I think it's encouraging to have opportunities like this to see that you're not the only one working in that direction, and that you have allies within the field, and that I think between all of us, we can continue to move this work forward through the little efforts in our organizations, through doing conference presentations, to submitting to the journals, and involving our students in that work and engaging them and having them help present as well, and really just giving them a place at the table. So I think even those tiny steps forward are steps forward. So I just don't want people to be discouraged by small beginnings. We all have to start somewhere.
Right. Thank you for that. I like having uplifting words to close us out of our webinar series. So I hope everybody got the evaluation, and we really do look forward to getting your responses. We didn't do an evaluation for each webinar. We only have it for the end of this, for the end of the series. So, but you'll have an opportunity to indicate which ones you attended and let us know what you think about it. And we at World Education will be continuing this work in various ways, and I know all of you will as well. And I really look forward to hearing more about it in all the ways that Carmen suggested. So thank you so much again to World Education, and thanks to Megan and Ebony for seeing us through. And thanks especially to you, Carmen, for being here with us today and making this webinar what it was. This closes our webinar series. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye. We'll stay here and look at the chat if there's any questions coming up. We won't quite end the webinar yet, but if there's any questions in the chat, we'll be here to check them out.